Hello, everyone. Welcome to another SF Masterworks discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about Last Enforcement by Olaf Stapleton. This is, I think, the 11th book in the series that we've been reading so far. Next book will bring us to a year of these discussions, which is awesome. And uh, we read one of these books every month in the order they were published as Masterworks. So the books coming up for the next 3 months are going to be Earth Abides by George R. Stewart, Martian Time Slip by Philip K. Dick, and The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester, a couple of repeat authors there that I'm very much looking forward to. With me, I have the usual group of friends. Jared, could you kick us off with introductions, please?
Yes, I am Jared. I run the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel, and I'm also on Speculative Speculations podcast with Chris.
Oh, I like what you did there. That was good. Totally caught me out. I was ready for another 10 seconds. So yes, my name is Chris Moen from the Chronicle of Chris YouTube channel. I also do speculative speculations, as Jared quite rightly says. I would kick it to Varsha, but Varsha started, so God, we're going to go to Livia.
Thank you, there. So nice meeting you, everyone. I'm Livia J. Elliott. I'm a podcaster. I host the podcast Books Undone, and I also write interactive fiction, which you can read mostly for free on Unearthed Stories. And I just launched my new book, so delighted to be here and joining on the discussions. And Susana.
Hello, my name is Susana Imaginario. I'm a writer and a very casual YouTuber at 10 of the Weird.
So this book, Last Enforcement, who wants to go first?
Well, okay, I'll rather go first. It's, again, different than all the others we read before. I'll give it that. And it was not the worst one for me. I mean, it started pretty bad. And then it got worse, yes. But by the end, I think I kind of understood what the author was trying to accomplish. Is just I did not agree with. Wow, it's a very ambitious story. He's pretty much trying to write the history not just of mankind but the entire solar system. And for someone, I don't know, I don't think there was a lot of research done in terms of biology, geology, even sociology. It just went with it. And the beginning was tough. It really annoyed me how there was no concept of the individual, just the wars of the nations, the way that everything was generalized. It was pretty bad, honestly, in my opinion. And then after the first catastrophe, biology went out the window. The time scale, it's just loose. But to be fair, at the end, we do have several time scales, and they do get more and more inaccurate. So I guess even though we have 4 time scales, I don't know why, but I don't think he was trying to be accurate, let's say. Once they went to Venus, but once they went to Venus, it was kind of okay because we were in the realms of fantasy. So yeah, it's fine. So it didn't annoy me as much as I thought it would at the beginning. I was really annoyed at the beginning.
If I can add, sorry.
No,
if
go
I
ahead,
can
go
add
ahead,
to
Olivia.
that, if I can add to that, is that this was published in 1930. So when it started, I was just like, you're forgetting about continental drift. And no, it turns out that it was actually put up as a theory a couple years after. So there are a few things like that there are things of science that were actually discovered or confirmed several years after, and that gives it, we are reading it in 2024, and there are many things here that we assume are going to be known, by that time it was completely different. My problem with it wasn't as much as a generalization, as Susanna mentioned. I'm okay with that, especially because this book, I think it is social sci-fi. And social sci-fi is a subgenre that ends up not focusing on the science, but is more about speculating on society. And because it tends to speculate on society, it tends to forego the individual in lieu of assessing the changes on society as a whole. And my problem with it was that because he was doing that speculation, he was doing it as a white man in 1930, and he was unable to bypass his biases, his racism, and his worldview to actually imagine new societies. So every new society that comes and goes, even hundreds of millions of years into the future, they are just like Earth in 1930. There are things that happen like after several evolutions and changes of humankind, and it shows the same dynamics, right? And that's basically what I cannot forgive for this book, because the author was trying to speculate on how society will change, but at the same time he was unable to because of his internal bias, right? So.
But why do you assume there was an internal bias of white male? It was, just like he didn't know about continental drift, and I don't think he was biased in that in that way. Or sorry, I'm just having issues with the white male part. He was he was the mind of someone of that time writing a book 100 years ago. There was no deliberate bias against or towards, if there was any bias, was against women in general. He really doesn't understand biology at all.
Well, the thing about bias is that it's never deliberate. It's unconscious, and we seldom know we have it. So unless we face a situation that actually conflicts with our beliefs and puts up the reality even in front of our faces, we are going to have a very hard time to actually recognize that we have bias. So I don't think he consciously knew he was biased, but just like everyone, even as we are talking here, each of us is biased. I think he also was. And one of the things that bothered me the most that I can say here is, for example, there is a part in which a Patagonian society rises up, right? And it's in South America, and he says that the capital of the world in that period of time was in the Falkland Islands, which is actually the only piece of England that exists in South America. It was reason it's considered to be a stolen territory. It's the only piece of South America that actually has an English population that speaks in English. So it's basically, we Latinos are just monkeys, because he didn't even acknowledge the existence of anything beyond United States of America or south to it until that point. And when he did, it was just a Falkland Islands, so mini England there. And there are several cases of that go through the book. But at the end of the day, yeah, he was biased, but it was a byproduct of his era. It doesn't mean that we cannot look back to it with a different eye and try to assess the problems that it brought up, basically. But that's just me. I didn't like it. So.
But in that case, he was biased against everything. I mean, the things he says about America and China and Germany and France, come on.
And Asia is called China. Like everything Asia is China. It doesn't exist. Mongolia and China, the same thing. I found that.
But that was the product of the time. That was the premise of the time. We can't judge.
Exactly, and it was a bias of the time. And currently, nowadays, we have a different one, and in the future, we will have a new one. So
I want to follow up on the bias of the time aspect of it, because I mean, yes, that's how I guess the colonials thought of the world, as with Europe at the center, and everything else is just some colonized form of Europe, like without any real individuality to their country. At least that's what I got from this book. And yet, like, was that the entirety of their thought, or is that how the author sort of reduced these countries? Because when he writes about them, my biggest problem with it throughout the first 4 chapters was that it wrote about countries as if they were individual people, right? Like, it did take away the individual altogether, like Susanna said, but it wrote about each country as if they had a single thought among them. And I think that is a gross oversimplification for a book like this. And the things that came out of that simplification, the things he said about those countries, just made me rail at him throughout. Like I was telling everyone before, that the first part of my notes are filled with expletives. So it is it the bias of the time to even think that individuals don't exist, that sure, they probably think of China as the Chinaman and give them certain attributes and stereotypes, but then, like, they're at least stereotypes. They expect people to behave a certain way. Like, it's like this guy is attributing really strange philosophies to entire countries. Like, it,
But I mean, I kept coming back to the fact that there probably is no worse time in history to try and write a future history than 1930s. You were just past the Wall Street crash, which I'm sure is probably what prompted the fact that it might be interesting to write a future history at this stage, because everything was in turmoil. And the advent of World War II changed the trajectory of First Man, if you want to say, like beyond the scale. There was no access to information. There was no access to information about other cultures other than what was the written word, essentially, at the time. And so what we know about the intricacies of, you know, other races, other cultures, etc., just didn't exist at that time. So people were very much a stereotype, even amongst the people that he knew. Like, I would say that the British, which he was, obviously, would have had a very one-note kind of feeling to them as well. That kind of stiff upper lip, etc., would have been as much that. So he would have known those people and still represented them exactly the same way. In fact, the whole God help us thing, which I actually thought was really quite funny as it played out. Every time they said God help us, I was like, that's actually, you know, quite humorous. And the fact that America, fall of Wall Street, etc., became the capitalist nation, I think sort of fit with what he knew at the time and what the world knew at the time. And so, like, I'm very, very reluctant to criticize the book for that, because in another 100 years' time, they might look at 21st century things and say, God, all of this talk about sex, of the difference of just two sexes, etc., it makes all of those books completely unreadable at the time, because we're probably just going to a homosex kind of future in another 200 years. So does that negate everything that we're talking about now? It does give it a certain lens to view it as, but I don't think it totally negates. I think the problems that I have with the book kind of sit outside that, because every time I hit one of those kind of things where I went, oh, that's not great, or otherwise it just kind of went, well, I mean, 1930s man, what how can I even relate to that person?
Yeah, I imagine 100 years from now, or I hope 100 years from now, people look back, yeah, can you believe that, you know, there were people that actually believed that women could have penises? So it should be interesting.
Yeah. No, I went into it with the biases in mind already. You could tell just by the time period it was written and the language he was already using, that there was going to be some sort of you know, bias that he already had. And you know, I looked a little bit into his background, and it's like, yeah, he's, you know, he's a writer, English writer, whatever. And it was like, okay, he definitely had that colonial type mindset when he started out. But he also, and I think it was a lot. There was definitely some unconscious bias going into the storytelling, and I just kept that with a grain of salt, and just threw it over my shoulder every time I encountered something that was like, okay, that this guy's definitely 1920s mentality, and I kept going, and you could see that his biases, he did try to keep it very general, like Susanna said, and he did that because he was writing about the whole human race and how the human race changed from Earth 100 million years after disasters and then Venus and then Neptune, and he's trying to keep the epochs different from each other and individualize the epochs of like this incredible time period that you can't even imagine, really. And that's what he was doing. He was imagining a time period that is a bewildering exercise, really, if you really try to think about it. And so he even said it right in the preface, the romancing the future can be an indulgence in ungoverned speculation just for the sake of the marvelous. And so he knew what he was doing, and there's a lot of irony in this book. When you go back and you look at like Chris was saying about the oh my god, or whatever it was you said there. Yeah. And he even there was one line near the end of the book where he said oh yeah, if the brain of the writer, your contemporary, because he's talking to a writer in the past, and he says your contemporary, the brain of the writer in such disorder as to be mostly rubbish. And that was a little bit of self-irony he put on himself. Yeah. He knew this stuff was mostly rubbish that he was making up, and he put it in that parlance, and it was the words and stuff and the way he wrote it was the parlance of the time. For a lot of text and a lot of stuff coming out at that time, if you read any history book written during that time, it sounds just like this. I have examples right here. Mark Bloch's Feudal Society, and if you read this, it sounds just like this guy's writing. And it's long, like long sentences, lots of commas, lots of explanation for an idea that today would probably take one sentence instead of 6 broken up sentences into semicolons and commas. And that was the style of the time, and he's kind of almost making fun of that, and he's using that to create this unrealistic, incredible, unthinkable history of the human race in all these weird different iterations. And so on the one hand, it's brilliant for that, and then on the other hand, it's totally unrelatable for probably a lot of people. So you get both sides.
Something that you mentioned that actually... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Susanna.
Oh, I'll just say that it's what happens when you're writing the history of man without taking into consideration the individual, the actually psychology of and biology of man. So he did it just from a cultural point of view, but even so, he didn't take into account any other species. He didn't take into account
Martians.
Just well, I wasn't even going there yet, because the Martian invasion was something. Okay, sorry, Olivia, continue.
That's fine. No worries. So what I was saying is that something that Jarrod mentioned that I found quite interesting is that the preface is him as an author kind of like breaking the fourth wall and saying, like, I'm going to try to write this and putting it up more than a history book as a frame narrative that he's trying to make an effort to translate, and perhaps with that say that, okay, it's going to be reduced to a view of the world from 1930s. But at the same time, it's just like, I live in a particular era, and as a reader, there are things that because of my context, I cannot forgive anymore, right? So it's, as I was reading it, it was always that conflict of, I understand your context, but I also have a context, and they are conflicting throughout the entire book, right?
And that's perfectly valid. That's like
entirely
perfectly valid context. And that, and so I have a feeling that this was unreadable to a lot of the population of the time.
Yeah, and
But
there
I
was
have a
also a
feeling,
story. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
but I also think that a lot of people who were in on the joke, so to speak, probably liked it a lot too. So I'm sure it was both sides, you know.
What I found out of this one is that he wrote it without knowing that it was sci-fi or that he was speculating. He just wrote it because that's what he wanted to write, and then he submitted it, and I think it was H.G. Wells that came back saying like, oh, dude, this is actually sci-fi. So he wasn't even aware of the genre he was writing in, and I think that also adds to that quality of historical text that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, for me, it's very much a political satire. Like, it's not, I don't think it's much else. It kind of mocks every nation in some form or others. It mocks his own nation. It mocks the Chinese, and it even eschews the fact that Africans even existed. Africa is this enormous continent, etc. Doesn't appear once in any of the stories or any of that culture.
It ends under Egypt, so south of Egypt, it just ends.
Nothing happened there at all.
Nothing happened there. So again, very representative 1930s. The world.
Well,
It's
just like you guys are saying. The first 3 or 4 chapters are actually horrible as far as the bias. Like, once he gets beyond a million years or so, it's actually a little better because
this edition has in the foreword it says skip the first 4 chapters in the foreword.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just like
there you go. Because once he gets beyond that part, it actually he gets beyond the current politics of the time, and then it actually flows a little better as a speculation of future, far future stuff. But yeah.
Susanna rightly says it becomes fantasy at a certain point, and that's the bit that it certainly becomes readable for me at that stage. Once like Venus, once they get the Venus, it's like, okay, this is not even humanity I recognize in a lot of ways, which is good.
So
sorry,
go on, Pasha. You haven't said much.
Oh, I was gonna. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Finish. Maybe I'll start. Maybe start a new.
I was gonna list my 3 main issues, because I stopped nitpicking about, the beginning was just awful. So I'm just okay, moving on. But it didn't actually. It wasn't taking himself seriously, clearly, and he wasn't giving much thought to his own. I mean, the book is filled, I have notes here of, excellent premises. This happened, and this happened, and then this happened. It's like 1 + 1 = 5 that are not completely unrelated. And he didn't give much thought. Like, for example, and some of the things are just awful. I don't know. I would like to think that someone, an editor, a publisher, a friend, who would point these things out. Like, for example, when on that society, they were all about flying and the planes, that throwing babies out of the planes was an alternative to contraception. I was just, what? How? Explain to contraception? I don't. That's not how it works. The whole thing with the divine boy, that the population would get old at 15, and then there was this, special guy that didn't age and had more sexual, I don't know, drive than the. First, I was thinking, okay, so if they get old at 15, they're going to have to hit puberty a lot earlier. To even manage to raise children, even with a low sex drive. And then this guy comes along and goes around all the villages, and I just start having this image of this man going around sleeping with all 10 or 8-year-old girls. And so you really didn't give it much thought to how this would work if everyone is old at 15. It's little details like this that are in the subtext. And after the big explosion, when everyone moved to the Arctic. So oceans boiled, we could see from space, and, the Earth was destroyed, but they were in the Arctic. Oh, and there was plenty of fish. And it's like, come on. Did you just notice what you wrote just a few paragraphs ago? This is This is insane. This is bonkers. So I don't know. One thing I would consider a mistake. 2, 3, 4. It was just, you weren't taking this seriously at all. And after that, I stopped taking it seriously at all. So it started being fun.
Yeah. Something that you said, actually, I was thinking along the same lines, the part of the flying people, that they all suddenly decide to just kill themselves. And this book has something that I ended up trying to explain to a friend, like generational suicide. Like there are several parts in the book in which a generation will say like, oh no, we have been outnumbered, or the other ones, the new ones are better, and so on, and they all commit suicide en masse. And I'm just like, humanity has throughout the ages like shown its right to exist. Like there will be probably wars and they will have to be killed, or a genocide will have to occur for humanity to stop fighting to be alive. And in many times we have that thing happening, that an entire civilization says, oh, the new ones are better than us, and one way or another they end up killing themselves. And I thought that was contrary to human nature. The one with the bird people that you mentioned, that's the worst, because suddenly they all go flying, they convince the kids even, and then just like a cult, they're out. And I found that, as you said, I think he didn't even try to research humanities or understand humanity's idea of perseverance, right? Societies have evolved and struggle to remain alive and existing and current throughout the ages. But then again, it's just like Chris said, the information that they had available at that moment and the ability to research. And let's just be honest, it's like there was a lot of science and great discoveries going on in that time, and he just ignore them. Probably because they were not white people. Probably because many of the people that did those discoveries were not from the countries he deemed as the key for this history of evolution, right? So I think there are several problems going on around that. And as you said, and I don't think it's just an error. I think it's something that he believed on, or perhaps was so innate to him that he didn't realize he was making those statements over and over.
So a couple of things. The superhuman thing, not that I've really read it in any great depth, but I think that's the Nietzsche concept, isn't it? They basically, through that Patagonia stuff, it was a lot of Nietzsche stuff that was coming through in that part of the book. But the part about the killing of the parts, it happens throughout the book. You know, a part of society is basically killed off. Sometimes it's the kids, sometimes it's the people that are flightless, sometimes it's the flighted people themselves. I thought that was quite interesting because he does it so often throughout the book. It's almost like he's saying like humanity has a propensity to sort of see some people as others and want to kill them off and not want them part of society. So like there are plenty of examples of that within human nature. I can talk about the British Empire expanding. There's any amount of that happens there. Even stuff that came a few years after what he did, even the dropping of the what would have been the atomic bomb essentially in Europe and Britain in this book as well. There is that idea. Some of it happened by design, and some of it happened by just bad luck. And I thought a lot of that was again satire of how ridiculous humanity had to do the same mistake over and over and over again, regardless of whether it was the first man, the second man, the third man, the fourth man, or whatever. This idea that they wouldn't let society flourish and grow naturally. They had to curtail it and change it in some way and manicure it to the point that it became what this small subsection of people thought was right. So I actually thought some of that was quite interesting without being, as you say, Libby, without being sort of scientifically accurate in any way whatsoever. Like it wasn't, but I never really took it as that. So maybe that was just part of it to come through. But there was so much happened in the book. I just found myself every kind of couple of pages going, I remember nothing of anything detailed in the last 5 pages because there's so much kind of thrown at me. Yeah. And you end up with the big things just coming at you that burst points throughout the book.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting.
But it was very well. That quote at the end, that even though time is cyclical, is not repetitive, it was kind of repetitive. It was the same cycle again and again, just happening in different ways, but it was the same cycle. And at any point, especially in the beginning, there was no negotiations. Oh, this country disagree with the other country. Oh, let's kill him. Let's find out the best way to kill them. Oh, but this virus, this might actually harm us as well. Oh no, but we're still gonna use it with the Martians things. I mean, every time it was just mutually assured destruction. They didn't care if they died as long as the other died as well.
Yeah. Well, I think
some humans might be like that, but in general, no. We like to survive.
I think that's an echo of the horrors of World War One that he was probably very familiar with, because he points out that because they use, of course, they use gas and stuff in World War One, which was the main horror that came out of that, and he came out with some somber notes about the hopes of humanity right at the beginning, and then and so those kind of, it's those changes that we're going about, cyclically and talking about in a cycle. It's millions of years that changes, and so we haven't even been around as long as some of those cycles were taking place. I mean, what I kind of took it as like the suicidal aspects as something that happened over a million years and not just like everybody all at once. And so, in that suicidal aspect was probably fresh on his mind from the amount of Wall Street people he saw jumping out of buildings and what have you at the time he wrote this. And so it's kind of a really weird dichotomy that he's writing. He seems to have these immediate historical events on his mind at the time he's writing about something that should be way far reaching than those immediate events he's alluding to. And because there was also this he had these notes of he mentioned once in the beginning that the peace which followed the European War was one of the most significant moments in European history. And if you had a million-year time span, it wouldn't be that significant at all. But that was the notes of the rise of optimism after World War One during the 1920s, up until the point when the crash happened and stuff like that. So, there's a lot he's putting into that is directly related to his own history that should not be if you're writing about a million years. And so it's kind of funny in that way.
Well, if you read a biography of the author, he was actually in World War One. He was actually drafted and everything, so that evidently had a huge impact on him. There was a part that I thought it was a subtle reference to Chamberlain, perhaps, because he was talking about the politics and how some people didn't want to go into another war, which was a perception that actually characterized the dynamics in the countries in Europe between the two wars as well. So I completely agree with you, Jared, that he was writing from his own experience, and that somehow affected, everything and how humanity will react, even when he was on the 15th man and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very pessimistic view of humanity, seriously.
Very.
Yeah. Some of the things that bugged me about the far future stuff was he still made little references back to our time, even though I was like, no, you should be long beyond that by now. but I understand how he could fall into that, but it was like, I was like, you should probably take that out.
But wasn't it interesting? I think through all the 18 stages of man that he went through, that progress never really happened for humanity at all until the very last iteration, when they basically run out of sun. In other ways, the world died, and then before they ever made any real progress from the first man, they were just different forms of and different trade-offs that they were going to have between them. That they would be smarter, but they would be less less embracing of a society. They weren't really bothered until the very end of cutting out ill feeling and stuff like that. So I thought that was one of the, again, very interesting parts of it, is while things changed and things moved along and shifted in one way, I didn't think that reading it that they were any further along than what we are today, like 60 years later, 80 years later from when he wrote it, you know.
Yeah, he tried to get around that by saying, you just won't understand.
Yeah,
a lot of the times.
Or
and
not in the detail. Yeah.
And he also wrote in the introduction about how he's writing something of a tragedy. If I remember correctly, he says something he's writing in the form of like, there will be tragedy. And so I guess the tragedies, the history repeating itself, and there are a lot of repetitive cycles and so on, which I don't think the author meant for this to be an inspiring history. Maybe. If he did, then for me it didn't work. Yeah, to your points, like in the beginning, I did try to think around the fact that this was written in the 1930s, and the biases of and the thought of the time will of course leak through the book, but there were some things that were the thought of the time that just inherently anger me, I think. So there was this particular section where there were two bits in particular that I got particularly mad at. There was one in which I think he said the China man traded cigarettes and gum for opium and joss sticks. Like that's just some random affliction they had, and like they didn't actively feed that addiction for opium a long time ago. Like, oh, you're being so cute about it. And then there was this bit where the second men, when they evolved, they broke off into all these different people, and eventually one of them became bred enough to become the enlightened of the species, which I guess, again, you can't blame the author individually for thinking that. It was probably the thought of the time that the Europeans were inherently superior, like they just were, so they had the right to colonize and enslave the rest of the world. But that still bothers me that you're like, and I guess everything that followed from there, every new enlightened species was just biologically superior to the others somehow, and that was pretty painful in the book overall. But about the far future too, like it did become better, and after we got past the second men, which I did find the vision for the second men somewhat inspiring, in that they were peace loving and they looked out for each other. So that had to reflect the author of like what he thinks a more evolved humanity would look like, and I like that picture of humanity. So there were some things there that I liked as I went, but also
it's interesting. I read it as not as they were more evolved than the first men, but that they went back to the roots. So they were as man was before society, before it became industrialized, and that's how I read it. So
the reason I say more evolved is because they had bigger brains and could think more and calculate more, apparently. But yeah, you're right. Like their societal structure was more resembling of like the pre-industrial societies, and maybe he's arguing that that's what made them more compassionate. But I thought it was something about like just their inherent biology, and the bigger brain, the better physical structure. I read it as better, but yeah,
they were yetis.
See
them.
Yeah. They are superior. It is a well-known fact.
You know, something that when I was reading it, something that I noticed, and it ties with what you said, Varsha, is that he goes into detail until every society reaches a style or way of being that is similar to 1930s, or that type of half industrial countries and so on. And after that, if they have to go into any science like space travel and so on, it gets fancier and fancier and fancier. Like he couldn't actually describe anything on those societies, and he will just, instead of describing the technology or how the people will interact with the technology, he will just go back to, for example, oh, this society flies and they did this, and this affected their world in this way and their social constructs in this way, or this other one sang and they had the songs. But he will always make societies reach that point as if he saw nothing else,
Yeah, exactly.
There
And
was-
that was my
yeah.
that was my issue with the future societies, that apparently, and it's a reflection of my problems with the earlier parts of the book, in that he speaks of the entire group as if they were one person and one mind.
Every time.
The future societies also do that. They apparently all, as a people, become obsessed with one thing, and that somehow drives them mad and brings about the end of the culture. So sure, but and I did, to be fair, I did like the things that they became obsessed over. It was interesting to read about the music and so on, but that seems strange as a thought process. Like, of course, that might just be how they thought back in the 1930s, that there is this ideal of this group of people that everyone aspires to, and then they work towards that. So maybe this obsessive thought was the ideal of the time, and so they work towards that. And but yeah, like that also I found very strange. I'd like to understand it more, but this repeated obsession with one thing for the people as a whole, and that apparently brings their downfall. And maybe there's commentary that the other interest. So structurally, I found the book very interesting. I think this is very different. It's unlike anything I've ever read. The whole structuring it as if it's a history book, and I liked it. I think I do appreciate that quite a bit, and so that gives it a certain objectivity. He's not giving any of his opinions on what he thought was good or bad. It's mostly just stating facts. And I think that is part of the reason why some of it is infuriating, the way he states things in the first 4 chapters as if they are well-known fact about entire countries. But he doesn't. So I think this book, for all my complaints about it, has made me think the most of the ones I've read. Like, I've argued with it the most, I've thought about it the most, and maybe like gone and done the most research after this. But it is what was my point? Yeah, he doesn't state opinions, so it's unclear to me whether he's saying this is a good society, this is the ideal, or just this is how it was. If he's making any commentaries on this is how things repeat themselves, is he saying this is the tragedy of humanity, that we will all eventually become obsessed with one thing and that'll be our downfall? Is that what he's saying? Or is that just like a really uninspiring view that he just thought of and then kept using over and over again? So I guess you could interpret things that you want, and you could get a lot of nice things about it. I think, like, when I allowed myself to be more charitable, get past my anger, I was like, yeah, there are some good points there if I could get out of them. But yeah, there's just still a lot that bothers me.
Like for example, it's like you said, society reached that point and wouldn't evolve. Like the ones that were all about flying. So they're all society revolve about flying, and yet they never thought about going to the moon or flying. If that what they were geared for, they were still they never tried space exploration. What was?
Yeah, but that was kind of an unreachable thing at the time he wrote this.
He couldn't. He couldn't conceive
so
it.
He
himself could not conceive it.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Even though, he could have, but he didn't. When he was the same thing with artificial intelligence and what now we call artificial intelligence and
the big brains,
digital world. Yeah, they were actually building a brain. So it was a product of its time, and yeah, it just kept there. It had no concepts, and I guess would we have concept of even like social media 50 years ago? Maybe not.
But-
I didn't.
I'm trying to forget it.
As somebody who was there 50 years ago, I didn't have any concept of that.
There was no
You couldn't even imagine.
technological age,
Nope.
or there was lots of stages that even in recent history that are very, very big, information age, etc., just didn't occur. Then quite rightly, I think, in some ways, because a lot of those things happen because of events over history.
Yeah, but it did thought about Martians, and it did went to Venus. So eventually he thought about going to other planets, but the moon, who cares about the moon?
Well, to be fair, H.G. Wells thought about the Martians thing first, so he did
okay.
the legwork for him.
Yeah, no, it's, yeah, he did predict a European Union of a sorts.
He did.
True.
He did.
The Blitz. There is a reference that could be interpreted as a Blitz as well.
Yeah, and he mentioned he had this one line that says, "But these were best, after all, a minority in a huge wilderness of opinionated self-deceivers, in whom, surprisingly, an outworn religious dogma was championed with the intolerant optimism of youth," which is still going on today. And he did mention how tribalism became very strong in some instances, which still happens today as well. So that there were a couple things he did have as a button on, at some point during the narrative.
And there was one thing Sorry.
Here's a scary thought. What if my biggest complaint is that he has no concept of the individual, but would there be any individual this time scale, which is completely I will get to the time scale because millions and millions of years, it's absurd, but the tribal thing, it is very strong in humanity. So maybe if you are actually looking back on the history of humanity, there's very few individuals that stand out. The further back you go, they just disappear. And then that's a very scary thought. And we see it now even in small groups. So maybe there was something there. We just, maybe it is weird that we can't see the scale of what he was trying to
I
prove.
think it's good to reiterate that the scale is just huge, and that it's really hard to imagine ideas and individual accomplishments going beyond that kind of a scale.
Yeah, I think it's also a matter of culture, because Western societies tend to be more individualistic, and I think it's natural that we would like to see more individuals coming up and making it more granular. But if you look at Eastern societies, they tend to be generally, in an oversimplification, a bit more conscious of the group as well. So it's, as Sarah said, on the one hand, history gets blurrier and less about the individual the further we look back, right? But at the same time, I think it's annoying us because we are so used to look at the individual, right? Even if we look at modern fantasy or sci-fi genre, it's mostly about the chosen one, or we follow a couple people and we have 2 or 3 POVs and that's it, right? We don't tend to look at those or have fiction that is currently written in that overarching way as well. So as a readers, this is also going to be different.
There's something he said about the Martian mind that made me think of human society too, that when they all coagulate and become one Martian mind, it is their basest thoughts that drive the thinking of the Martians. And I feel like that is true of human society sometimes, that the most, I guess, the worst elements sometimes tend to gain popularity and become the thing that everyone thinks. But it may not be something that everybody thinks, but something that might drive government decisions, for instance. But and in some sense, I feel like this was sort of a picture of how humanity got from that kind of culture and society to making the highest thoughts, for some definition of highest, the driving factor of the society as a whole. Like when they when he talked about the unified mind at the end, like the tribal mind, they would all improve each other, they would not bring each other down, whereas the Martian mind brought each other down. So I feel like it's a bit of an evolution in that sense, that he's writing about how humans got from that kind of thinking to always picking what they think is the best form of thought. There are a couple of things other things that I wanted to bring up, because there's this one section where he talks about how everybody had to resort to agriculture. That was the only thing that they could do. And he referred to the people of the time as bumpkins, yokels, and the work they did as drudgery. So this is supposed to be someone from the far, far future talking to a person of this time. Sure, this is probably how they think about it. You could make a case for, he only gave them the thoughts, and then the guy who wrote it used the language that he knew of. Sure. But these are all terms that are, how do I put it? I think relative, for lack of a better word, that someone who feels themselves superior to the others doing this work, or in engaging in agriculture, would think of. Like, you have to have a more sophisticated society, for some definition of sophisticated, to think of these people as bumpkins, yokels, and the work they do as drudgery. And yet, this is a society that this is the only thing that they are doing. They probably don't think of themselves in those terms. But this guy from, like, I don't know, 2 billion years in the future is passing judgment on them as yokels and bumpkins. Like, that just doesn't fit in the structure. It is a small complaint, but it did add to the pile that I was building.
Was it not at that stage, though, that they could reference the former lives of man then by looking back? That was part of their revolution at that stage. So they were able to look back at that stage and use that. Like I do say, it's not, you would think they would look back and reflect and say that those weren't the words to use at that stage, because it is very much the be all and end of society, but they could have just been using, I'm making excuses for him at this stage, using the terms of the people of the past times to do,
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, and like I said, like, you could say, the writer that he's talking to is applying his own filters and using his own favorite language. But in as much as you are a species capable of influencing the mind, maybe don't resort to condescending language like that.
Yeah. No, I do agree. I was trying to make a counterpoint, and I didn't really believe it myself, to be honest.
But that was actually quite clever, again, in a very twisted and simplified way, because I was ranting throughout the book. I said, no concept of scale. We only have like 10,000, 20,000 years of recorded history, barely 2,000 years of properly recorded history, never mind. But it's like, how would any of this survive, especially after so many mass extinctions? How does he know how people would not care, that Germany was fighting whatever? They wouldn't even have a concept of Europe, for example. Why does this matter? And then when he came up with that idea that they could go back and learn from the minds of, and then I was like, okay, so you do learn from the individuals, so why are you writing again from, it's these little inconsistencies. Like the premises were great, the ideas, but then conclusion didn't fit. There was always this gap, which was a shame, because if it wasn't for that, brilliant, even with all the the shortcomings of the time that it was written.
Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, I sort of want to talk about the fact, especially when comparing this with some of the other books, the book's not very readable. You know, it's not the kind of thing you couldn't wait to pick up and read the next bit of. And I think for that reason, while it is very different from everything else, it reads as an artifact. It doesn't even read like a good non-fiction story in a lot of ways. It just reads as a series of events that kind of ponder you to think rather than a sort of cohesive work in some ways, because it does kind of have this bit where the first couple of chapters are what we would consider to be recent history and stuff we can identify with, and then moves progressively into the fantasy. But at no stage do you get an idea that, like a couple of other people said, there's no kind of overarching theme of what he's trying to say or trying to pull together. So it's a bit of a trudge, I think, for most people to read. I would imagine at some stage you were kind of going, right, I'll get another through bit of this. I will say, in my part, I sort of lost the ability to see through Hayfever this week. So I was forced to do audiobook, and I think that actually helped me quite a bit because I could sort of listen along to the as just almost like a news report of somebody reading events out to me rather than necessarily reading and engaging. And I think that helped me quite a bit throughout this book because I was like, okay, I could sort of, when it got to the end of the chapter, I was like, right, that's the section done. Let's move on to the next stage in history. And I wonder actually whether my experience of that actually changed my overall, view of the book as a whole.
Yeah, it does read more like a news report than an history book. Yeah, it's a report. Good point.
Yeah, but I did find the structure rather intriguing, and honestly, for me, I didn't feel like it made the book more unreadable. I mean, I'm not saying that it's not different and difficult. It could have been slightly difficult to read, but okay, let me go the other direction. Sorry, I thought it was pretty readable for how it was structured, and it was dense. I think, like history books probably tend to be. I don't read very many, but
the older ones, definitely.
The old ones, yeah.
I was going to make a comparison. Like, this is an older one. It reads like this, and this is a newer one. This is a more recent history book. This history book has shorter, relatable sentences. It has a storytelling quality and aspect to it that the old history books completely lack. And so that's the difference. Like, history books today have moved into trying to be relatable to the reader and telling the story of history, whereas history books back then were giving you a report, like you guys said. And this is he's definitely stealing the style of the times to use as his structure for this fantasy sci-fi thing.
Yeah. So, but to answer your question, Chris, for me at least, it wasn't the structure that bothered me at all. In fact, that gave me something to sort of analyze besides the stuff that was bothering me in the actual content of the book. So yeah, in that sense, I think I'm not entirely sure. And I did try the audiobook, and I found it harder to follow and pay attention to the audiobook because of how dense it was. But yeah.
I have to admit, after those first few chapters, which my issue was with the content, not the writing, I found it, well, it was okay. It wasn't entertaining, but thankfully it was quite easy. The prose was long sentences, but it was quite simple to read. And I have to admit, I was curious, even when I was, enraged and ranting and said, this is stupid, it's stupid. I still wanted to know just how stupid it would get. Because at some point it was like, what is he going to come up? What is going to happen next? How is it going to get any worse? Come on. So I kept reading small doses. It took me a long time. I was reading like 10 pages a day. But, it is something. It's not every book. There's some books that even when they are, beautifully written, I lose interest in whatever it's going on. No, it kept me engaged because I wanted to know just how does this end? How worse can it get? Where are they going now? Are they going to Neptune? Oh, okay, sure, let's go. It was always a surprise in some regards, even though then the story would repeat. But
yeah,
I appreciate that. Let's say that's what I'm trying to say.
This book. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I thought he got poetic towards the end, especially with regards to the Last Men. He had a relation of the Last Men to what he called the music of the spheres, and I thought that was very poetic stuff there, where he's talked about the music of the spheres is of a complexity almost infinitely more subtle than actual music being a pattern of intertwining themes that evolve and die. And I thought his descriptions of that, and as he got towards the Last Men, he almost moved into a more poetic voice to try to give the Last Men like this grand send off, and especially the very last line of the novel was, for we shall make after all a fair conclusion to this brief music that is man. So even after billions of years go by, man is still brief, and I thought that was a good poetic way to end it.
Yeah.
Everything comes to an end.
I really like the two bits of the book that got all poetic about music, like the ones that who eventually ended up obsessing over music, to, I guess, as usual, went insane and died. But the parts before that, where they talked about what the music meant to these people, and then in the end where he speaks of the cosmos with metaphors for music, I think I really loved those bits. Those were very nice. Do you guys know who Uncle Roger is? The YouTube channel?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, for those who don't know, he does food reviews, and he mostly rants at people when they make mistakes. But the moment they do something good, he goes, "That's good, that's good," but then goes back to ranting immediately after when they make mistakes. I was like that while reading the book. Rant. Oh, that's good. Rant.
Interesting choice, fortunately, given that that's a voice that he puts on that's jingoistic and stereotyped in a lot of ways as well. Like it's a character that he's acting rather than his real voice and using a stereotype, but he is very funny. I do like Uncle Roger.
Yeah. I was going to say, this book made me appreciate Cities in Flight both more and less because, well, not that I appreciate it much, but like I appreciate it less sometimes.
I feel like there's a PhD coming. Come on, let's go. Let's get into this.
So Cities in Flight, I look, for all my ranting about it, I keep having to remind myself that it was 4 books, and the first one I actually really liked. The second one was nice. It was when Amalfi showed up that I got annoyed by it. So that book annoyed me. This one, largely, in as wherever I didn't like it, infuriated me. So in that sense, Cities in Flight, I appreciate a little bit more now because at least half of it I liked a lot. And the other side of it, in that I think it was published in the 50s, at least the last book that saw the end of time. I think that was pretty late compared to this book, right? And at the time I read it, I wasn't sure what they knew of the time scales involved in human history and in the history of the universe and so on. So I didn't want to judge the fact that the universe will end 20 years from now a little too harshly, but
there's a chance the way things are going.
But now these guys are like speaking millions of years ahead. All the histories are millions of years ahead. When they speak eventually, it's not even the end of the universe they speak of, it's the end of time as they know it and of the solar system. So it's still a pretty small conclusion in the grand scheme of things versus like the universe ending in 20 years thing that Blish did. So in that sense, I appreciated that bit less. Yeah. And I really like, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it's interesting, and I'm being total devil's advocate here, but Cities in Flight is a book about the individual far too much. I am Alfie, and
Yeah.
this is a film where it doesn't have the individual enough in it. There's sort of like
Yeah.
they're the two opposite ends of the scale, and I think it's fair to say that the two books I've liked least out of all of the 11 that we've done here, like the good book sits somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it does do a in a lot of senses, I think it does a lot of what Cities in Flight does. It maps out a large portion of human history. Except, yeah, like you pointed out, Chris, like completely different ways. Like one through the individual who just lives forever and won't shut up, and the other and the other through like just from a very distant lens on humanity.
It is interesting. Book 3 of Cities in Flight is all could almost be a section out of this book. You know, that kind of that evolution of one of the stages of man in there is very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
No, and that brings me. How many books, how many stories were inspired by this, especially space operas?
Yeah.
I can see this being the inspiration for many space operas.
Yeah.
Well, it's a book of ideas, isn't it? That's literally every you take any 5 pages out of this book, and you've got a space opera series. Never mind just one book. You just kind of build it in one. So yeah, I like that point a lot, Susanna.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see a lot.
I'm not sure if it was a genre back then. When did it start being a thing? But likely not. I guess this was clearly.
I think it's actually considered one of the first space operas in that sense.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I really like the metaphor he used for the timescape in the beginning, how it's like we're moving through a landscape of time and we'll keep dipping down occasionally to look at things in more detail, but essentially we have to skip over entire segments to go over it. So I liked that metaphor, and I had high hopes for the book when I encountered it. And I think it does fulfill that promise to a great deal. I'm being a bit unfair, but it does fulfill that promise quite a bit. And I think the scope of his vision is large, like to be able to think at those timescales, even I think it is mind-boggling. And even what he accomplished, I think, is a lot. And I like the themes and patterns he built into it, even though he calls it nonsense in the end. That I don't necessarily like the actual themes and patterns. I like that he did build themes and patterns into each stage of evolution. So yeah, there's a lot I did like about it. And I liked the 2 alien species. The Martians I thought were pretty clever. and I think in that I saw a little bit of Children of Time there, in that you could read parallels between the Martian society and the human society, even though they were so vastly different from each other. And I really liked that. And I also liked that each thought that the other were imbeciles and the Martians thought that the telephone posts were the actual sentient creatures of this world.
Something that I found interesting on the Martians is that they were the result of an outlook from humankind, you know. He made no effort on trying to explain the Martians in a more neutral way. It was very opinionated how he presented them, because at the end of the day, this is called Last and First Men. It's an overview of humankind. And he was looking at the Martians with that view, right? With the view of, I think it was a second man or something, and how they saw the Martians in particular. But I did, on the one hand, I thought it was clever as well, not the kind of human in a custom alien that we often see in sci-fi, like Star Trek. But anyways, but at the same time, I got the same impression that Jarrod, that it could have been his fear of what came out of World War I put up as a race, as a species, actually, that came to threaten humanity. And it was, in that case, it would have been just the fear embodied, you know.
Yeah, and you see a lot in that. There was also mention of earlier on the book about Russians, and they that was also a pervading fear at the time, the Red Scare and all that stuff, and he mentioned it in a more he actually was a bit more diplomatic than how people thought at the time, honestly, because that was an actual a real big fear and bias at the time, and but that was mentioned. He mentions he has he mentions religious feuds, interpretations of sacred scriptures, recurrent fluctuations of thought from naive animism through polytheism and conflicting monotheisms, and all the desperate isms, as he says in there, which was a little touch of humor
Clever.
there. And so I thought that was fine, but that was also a thought, a intellectual discussion of the times over religions and over free thinking stances of societal thought at the time as well. So he manages to throw a lot in there from those very fears that we mentioned about World War One and all those things that probably scared him about World War One and what it could have been and what it did to society at the time. And I think that's pretty relevant in his process of putting this out.
Yeah, and there is actually that now that you mentioned, there is a single quote that I actually got from the book, and it's along those lines. It says, "In some minds, the defense of the human spirit was sincerely identified with the defense of a particular nation, conceived as home of an enlightenment," and that is a world a view of the world at the time, and even now, almost 100 years after World War I, we keep thinking that way. That we keep doing things because of that nationalism or that view that one social construct beyond a country or beyond a nation is the home of the Enlightenment. And that carries through the book, that vision, that particular notion that I think Varsha mentioned, that he picks one thing and everybody aims for that thing, is that he's always trying to find that quote unquote enlightenment of every society and what they will aim. And again, it's just a reflection of what they were seeing at that time. Those big wars were, at the end of the day, an ideology against another. And the conclusion in an oversimplification, right? But it's basically that fear again put up in this writing.
I also think what's interesting for me reading it is trying to read this and having to keep on reminding myself that World War II hadn't happened in his world. It kind of shows you how those major events influence our thinking now. I just think that bit's really fascinating, and so far as like I think all that couldn't have happened. And you're like, but if World War II, if you didn't know World War II happened and everything that happened in World War II, it would change. It changes so much about what we know about society and about humanity at its base level that it's hard to conceive of how to even read this.
Well, a lot of the geopolitics and the dynamics between countries we have now came up to existence after World War II or because of World War II. So it makes completely sense that he actually can't fathom that future, because that war literally changed the paradigm for humankind.
Yeah, certainly did.
What did you guys make of the fact that it felt like it was each society was answering the question, what would this society go to war over or worship, right? So what do you think of the fact that each iteration of man ended up becoming a monotheistic society eventually? I I guess there's two ways to think about it. One, that kind of thinking leads to downfall, perhaps, or the other is that he does think that that is the way to be, and because of the, I guess the European culture is monotheistic, so was at 1930, and is he just like projecting there and like is not really expressing an opinion on the matter?
To me, it was
I
highly
think the first
opinionated.
option. Yeah, I think the first option, Rafa, I think he was warning about the dangers of monotheism. Just maybe just the dangers of this unified thinking. You know, it works very well when it's towards peace and innovation and everyone's getting along. But when an entire society is set in destructing, just annihilating another, yeah, that's it. That's very dangerous.
I have mixed opinions on that thing because most religions, and I'm not talking about faith, I'm talking about religions like the structure, they have caused as much good as much bad or problems throughout history, right? It's like nobody's clear in that regard. But he does mention several times Christianity, and that's a preponderant religion in Europe at the time, right? So I think he was writing from what he believed was perhaps a worldview or what humanity should aim for, right? To me, it was another reflection of his bias and his way of seeing the world. That whole part of the enlightened boy and so on, it has a messianic quality to it, and there is a low-key comparison to specific figures of Christianity in particular. I think it was quite an obvious reference to Jesus, right? And again, I think it's because that's what he believed, right? And if we consider that Middle East didn't exist to him, south of Egypt that didn't exist to him, Latin America didn't exist, and those are all societies that at some point had religions that were not monotheistic, right? So to me, there was a relationship there, and his bias speaking or creating this story.
Yeah, but I think he was very tongue-in-cheek with that.
I don't think it was the religion itself, being Christianity or whatever. It is the type of thinking that leads to a monotheistic religion. And think about all the things that each man got obsessed. You know, the flying, the music, the aesthetics. It was in itself a religion, a monotheistic religion. Just that you just focus on that thing, and the entire society revolved around that thing. It doesn't matter if it's a god or a plane or a song. You know, it's the same mindset that leads to downfall.
Jared, you were saying?
No, that's right. She got it.
Well, at the end of the day, we as humanity have a tendency to anthropomorphize gods and divinity in reality, but you can worship anything, right? At the end of the day, it's as you say, Susanna, humanity can worship anything, even music, as they have at the end.
I was going to say, beware Taylor Swift. I hear you.
And what do you guys think of the fact that in the end he says the people who stand out throughout history, they are singularities in that we think that an alien of some sort or some future more evolved mind is speaking to them through I don't know, using the same mechanism that the last men are speaking to humans. And the examples he quotes are Jesus, Gotham, and one other person I forget. But he does quote the prominent religious figures there. And I think they are people who we could argue are the best of humanity. I thought it was a bit pessimistic that he says it's not actually you who did that. Some aliens came into your mind and made you think in a better way.
Now,
But yeah, I wanted to ask your opinions on that.
I don't know if I'm giving it too much credit or less, but it did occur to me. So the book is titled Last and First Man. So did the last man influence the first man this entire time?
Ooh.
They talk about singularities in which they did influence, but I don't think it was throughout, but there were points.
But those figures, they were crucial for the development of the first man.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is possible. Like, I don't think he mentioned specifically which singularities resulted in the development. So yeah, it could very well be that they were driving aspects of history. And whenever a story does that, I want to start arguments about determinism and free will and so on. But
yeah, that's interesting because it's is he hinting at that kind of thing? Is he hinting at a lack of free will of a sorts? It's I don't think he goes. I don't think it goes that far. Other than just to throw it out there, you know, there's the possibility.
It's the thing about time travel, even if it's just in the mind. The moment you go to the past, then you are just setting things up. You get into that loop.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because all of the societies he has here, except the last man, they are all focused on the current time or in the past time, and that's it. They never tend to look up into the future or to see how they could evolve, except the one that created the big brains, that they were the only ones like trying to find an evolution or to go, but that part is just bonkers. And at the end, they are all looking at the past and acting in terms of the past or the present. They have little vision. And I think it adds to that idea that the last man could be influencing the past. There is no need for them to look at a future that is the past for them, basically, right?
Yeah.
And at the time that we could actually reach the last man and see their future, they are again nearing the verge of destruction, right? Which is that cycle of, I think the saddest part of the book is that humanity can never, even after millions of years, humanity can never leave that cycle of destruction that we are in.
Yeah. I think he has a he says that, but he also gives you this kind of hint that, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing to be around for, 100 billion years, and we had a good run. So, but I think he's kind of saying that as well, because once again, how can we imagine that amount of time?
Yeah.
I could, when I was a teenager, I couldn't even imagine being 60. Never mind billions and billions of years. But,
he does postulate that that cultural well-being can influence metaphysical things. So doesn't he talk about the fact that cultural thought is what actually brought the moon down upon the earth, and in some ways it shifted a movement in the planets. A lot of that stuff broke my brain. Like, I love the stuff about how physics work out. That's why I just ended it. This is a political satire, because every time we talk about physics, I was like, physics isn't going to, like, lots of things can change, but physics isn't going to change. Wavelengths don't change, all of that kind of stuff. What are you talking about? But let's go back to people flying. That's interesting. Yeah. Or moving the orbits. Let's hit the joystick and move our orbit of Neptune as close to the sun as we can have. Like, that'll not have any other effect on the rest of the galaxy. That's fine.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, a lot of those discoveries came up roughly after this period or in this period, and academic writing in 1930 wasn't accessible. Like they will have to send the papers by mail back and forth, and they will take several years to be published. And that continued until the 80s. And I picking up from what you said, Chris, I think we take so much science and knowledge for granted.
Yes.
Right. Because looking back at this, it's like there are things that for now are now quote unquote obvious that he doesn't know as an author, right? And that comes out through the writing. And I think that's part of that clash of the modern reader that's saying, like, I was reading all of this and I was saying, like, but the continent doesn't change. Like, it's millions of years and there is no continental drift. And then I went in because I had a rough idea that it was near World War II. Went in and checked, and yeah, it happened several years after this book was published. So a lot of things happened like that, and physics was a field that advanced a lot between World War I and World War II, and even at the turn of the century.
Yeah, I will be a bit more forgiving. I didn't realize that there was no way that he could know about continental drift. Of course, there was no way that he could know about DNA. He had to pretty much guide himself through a little bit of I hope he read The Origins of the Species. Now he should know that. And the little that was known about the solar system. So I will take that into consideration. Yeah, it was a little bit mean not to. Yeah.
Oh, what was it? But for all that, he probably didn't know things. He talks about the germ seed or something to, I think that you could interpret as DNA or what are the cells, embryonic cells, the stem cells. Like you could interpret them. Yeah. So
he did kind of predict stem cells a little bit. Yeah.
I thought that was pretty cool. That for what was known at the time, the predictions that that science fiction sometimes makes, which turns out to be actual theory in the future. I think that's pretty awesome. Oh, there was one thing that I found a bit baffling. He kept talking about matter annihilation. And I looked up when antimatter annihilation was predicted. It was 1928. So it seems that he may have got wind of the theory, but he talks about electron and protons annihilating together, which yes, right theory, wrong particle.
Now. How would he know?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is pretty cool that he applied, like, whatever he knew of it, he applied, and it's to great effect. I think so. I was impressed by that. I was confused. I had to go, like I said, it made me do some research, this book, and do a lot of thinking. One more question, food for thought question. The yearning for the eternal mind at the end, what did you guys think of that? It felt a bit on the edge of, but not quite Buddhist philosophy to me, but and it was an interesting idea. It felt strange that they would yearn for it, but overall, that was another one of my nice takeaways from this book for the ending. What did you guys think of that?
I think he did a bit of leading up to it, where he kind of talked about the last kind of version of man kind of having this mono mind, the fact that they had lost their individualization at that stage, and that they kind of only stepped outside of it every now and again. And again, he fudged it by saying, I couldn't go into the details of exactly how it all worked, but let's just say that this is what it looked like, this 96 minds coming together to create something greater as a part of their sum, rather than just being the individual. So I think he did a nice way of leading up to kind of like the one thing of evolution that humanity was kind of evolving towards by the end of the story. So after 2,000 billion years, we got something new, or something that we were aiming towards in some way that we could recognize as a fact today of like attainment or enlightenment that we might look at from our point of view.
Yeah. There was another rather, and I saw that eternal mind thing as sort of, I guess throughout the book there is a bit of a yearning to live forever, right? And Cities in Flight did that too. So in that sense, it reminded me again of Cities in Flight, where they talk about man living forever without maybe thinking of the consequences of what that would even mean. I think the weight of existence is real, and Cities in Flight didn't address it, and neither did this book. So it just like, we wish to live eternally, and so we did. But one thing it did do is that it scaled up childhood and adolescence to similar timelines, so that it maybe they don't feel the weight of existence that much.
I actually
Well,
thought some of that stuff was quite. Sorry, Nivea.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say that humanity has chased immortality for too long.
Yeah.
It's a normal idea that he has like nothing out of the ordinary.
No, it's not out of ordinary. I was saying that he didn't address the consequences of immortality.
Oh yeah, I think there are few works that end up addressing the consequences of immortality, and he was looking at it in such a large scale that it couldn't be. I don't think it would have been appropriate at the early stage to treat that, because if you take a look at immortality, what are the things that we can say? Probably the fact that you are going to survive your loved ones and the pain that's going to bring, right? But again, he's looking at that in that huge overview of humanity as a whole, and he took into consideration overpopulation at one point, but not after, right? So it's like at that point, when he reaches that idea, it didn't seem like a concept that would be that groundbreaking for the society he was trying to depict.
Yeah, that
At
makes
least
sense.
that's
I
my
think
opinion.
the right place to address it would the best place to address it would probably have been for the first species that lived much longer than
Right.
the
'Cause
first
I
men
think-
did.
Yeah, because I think addressing the consequences of immortality might be what you guys were saying earlier about the individual thing. That might be a more individualistic need to as a story vehicle, whereas in this case, I think it's too big concept in order to focus down on that individual need to address the consequences of immortality.
But wouldn't that be something? I mean, because it is. I guess lots of people would like to live longer, if not immortal, at least younger for longer. Wouldn't that be something that an entire society would happily dedicate their resources and brain power to achieve?
And I think a lot of the societies did actually achieve that. As the societies ended for whatever various reasons that came up in the book, but they did achieve, compared to our view of, we know we're all going to die, like, most of you guys will probably be on 100. I might reach 70, who knows, but but that's such a tiny thing compared to what some of the societies and the individuals in those societies achieved. They achieved, thousands and thousands a year, whatever that could be a considerable, almost immortality like kind of state of being.
I get Last Man, but even that wasn't enough. They were still that was the tragedy.
Well, it also begs the question whether the first to the 17th man didn't reach immortality as well, because we may be thinking of it as something physical, right? That a body, an individual will endure. But also, as Jarrod said, do we continue to exist as long as somebody remembers us, right? If we have history from a past country, do they continue to exist? Do we continue to remember, I don't know, Aristotle or any other philosopher simply because we know they existed, right? And in this case, you could say that all of these societies that came and went, that are self-destroyed or ended up in one way or another, that seemed to be at that point mass destruction, they were remembered. They still exist because these last men were able to come back to the past and tell us their story. So it's rather than perhaps a physical immortality, more one of based in memory, the memory of the societies.
Yeah, I mean that's that's getting pretty deep into philosophy there, and that's and that might be all his point. What his point is really is that mankind achieved it in a way for the time before their whole universe exploded or whatever it was that the sun did at the end there, and that's part of his music of the spheres, I guess. That's what his philosophical output was.
Yeah, that's a nice closing thought. Does anyone have more questions? Not questions. Sorry, I don't know why I think I'm running a design meeting.
Oh, Boss has got all the answers. All right.
Yeah, sorry. Any more thoughts? Not questions. This is not a design meeting.
The only age of man that I would want to live in was the one where they were all just flying about and they couldn't give a shit about anything else. I mean, that seemed to be the only one that seemed any worth living. They were like, oh, there's still shit happening, but look, hi, we're up. I'm waiting for a wee fly today. That's it. That's the only thing that matters. I actually really enjoyed reading that.
And that was some Wall-E level existence there, right? Because they brought the food to them so that they never have to go down. They're like, we'll let the food fly around too, so we can just grab at it whenever we need some.
Even their version of genocide was like, anybody that couldn't fly, it's not worth living. They'll be dead within 3 years anyway. Most of them, it was like, they're not with us.
Well, I changed my my rating from to okay. So it was a good discussion.
Yeah.
It's amazing that a book that's we can talk about for an hour and a half.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's nice. I like that sometimes we go back and change ratings after the discussion. Yeah. I want to change my rating, but no, I think I'll keep it where it is. I can mull about it offline. I don't need to do it here.
I wonder how I'll feel about it in a year's time. That'll be one of those when we've done another 10 books in this, and I look back. I wonder how I'll feel about it, because I wondered that about a lot of these books actually as it goes on. Because you haven't just finished them within 2 weeks and trying to think quite deeply about what you're going to say in these discussions. I think changes as time progresses.
Yeah. And even I think just talking about it changes how I feel about it. Like yesterday, I was trying to complain to my husband about something from the book. And then I was like, no, maybe he means this instead. Maybe he's not saying that this is a good thing. Maybe I am misinterpreting that. And then so just talking about it or thinking about it out loud makes me look at it differently than like what was going on in my head when I just want to be angry at the line on the page.
But at the end of the day, we are just looking at it from our own perspective, and basically by doing this type of discussions, we share the points of view and we can see it from a different angle.
So. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And ironically, in some ways, in doing so, because this is the only book we've read of those, we're sort of using our own personal biases and cultural kind of references as a way to look at it. And so it's almost like everything comes 180 on the reading of it, and it makes one of the nice things about having a group as culturally diverse as this to be able to do that. It's very, very, very cool.
Yeah. That is really cool. I feel like there is some pressure on the next book because it's going to be the first anniversary of this reading group. But yeah, I am excited for that, and I'll see if there's anything we can do to celebrate 1 year. But For anyone still listening, the next book is going to be Earth Abide for the month of July, and the 2 books coming up after that are Martian Time Slip and The Demolished Man by Philip K. Dick and Alfred Bester, respectively. We will see everyone then, but before I log off, let's do outros. Jared, maybe start us off again.
All right. I'm Jared from the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel and Speculative Speculations podcast and page chewing lurker. Next.
Be me again, I suppose. Chris Mohan from the Chronicle of Chris YouTube channel, and also on Speculative Speculations and page chewing lurker as well. Livia.
Thank you. And I'm Livia J. Elliott, host of a Books Undone podcast, also a lurker of the page chewing forums and a writer. And Susanna.
First, thank you, Varsha, for another great discussion. You can find me at the page chewing forums, on my YouTube channel, Den of the Weird, on X as Chronodendron, and my books are available everywhere. The series is called Timelessness. First one is Weird Gods. Go check it out.
Excellent. And Livia, you have a new book coming out. Do you want to mention
Oh,
that?
yeah. I found this one. The Genesis of Change, a philosophical fantasy, coming in July 16. So if you subscribe to my newsletter, the ebook will be free there. So
awesome. Well, congratulations.
Thank you,
on
Varsha.
that launch.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, check out everyone's books. Check out the app Unearthed Stories. Check out everybody's YouTube channels. We will see everybody in a month. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.